Hello everyone and welcome to Seeds of Hope, Regenerative Agriculture with Elena Garides. I'm your host and this is episode number 8. On this podcast, join me on a journey across the regenerative agriculture ecosystem through conversations with farmers, founders, investors, and changemakers as we discover what it takes to create healthier soils, food, and communities. Today, I'm thrilled to share with you my conversation with Erica Campbell, co-founder of InCommon Group, a strategic communications, research, and policy firm focused on the farm and food sector. Her clients include Big Picture Ranch, where she's helping lead the 100 Million Acres social campaign for the Common Ground movie, and we'll talk about this also during our episode. Erica previously worked for Kiss the Ground, leading the Regenerative Agriculture Farm Bill campaign. She started her careers in the 90s, focusing on developing local food systems in Vermont and the Northeast, and then transitioned to policy, where she worked for Senator Bernie Sanders as an advisor on food and ag issues. Now she splits her time living between Vermont and Kansas City. Our conversation today could not be more timely, as states like California begin defining regenerative agriculture and various certification programs are established around the country. Many of us are left wondering, what exactly is regeneratively farmed food, and how is it different from organic? How can we as consumers find regenerative products and distinguish between the different certifications? Erica brings clarity to these complex questions while sharing insights from her work on the front lines of agriculture policy and transformation. Ready to learn something new today? Let's jump right in.
Good morning, Erica. How are you doing today?
Good. I'm doing well, Alina. How are you?
I'm good. It's been a beautiful spring here in Miami. And yes, we're going to see each other in March in Chicago for the Regenerative Agriculture Summit. And you're going to be moderating a panel there. So I'd love to dive into some of these conversations about regenerative versus organic. What is the difference? And look into some of the certifications. But to kick us off, you've had a really interesting journey yourself in your career, from building out your network in Vermont to working with Bernie Sanders on agriculture policy. And I'm curious, if you look back, what's your biggest aha moment about what it really takes to create change in the food system?
You know, it's so interesting because I'm not one of those people that usually has aha moments. I've been asked that before, and I always think, what is that moment? And I rarely can identify a pinpoint. And I think that is because I'm very much a systems thinker and really look for patterns and interconnections. And I love to explore the complexity of humans and their relationship to the environment and their communities, which actually is why I found food systems so compelling. The biggest drivers for me have always been environment and health and community. And, food intersects so much with all three of those things. Looking back, I think it was probably 1989 or 90. I was in high school and I read Francis Moore Lape's Diet for a Small Planet. And it really influenced me. First of all, it influenced me to become a vegetarian, which I am not anymore. But it really talked about the intersection of the way we produce food and the environment, which, was very profound for me and really led me down a path of food systems and really seeing the power of, in the 90s, seeing the power of the organic food movement and how that movement kind of came together. There was wonderful farmers around the country, but, communities really rallied to support their farmers and advance the organic movement. And I really, at that point, started to go down the path of local and regional food systems because, the organic movement was heavily rooted in local and regional food systems and people getting connected back with their food and the farm to school movement.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also got very interested in soil health. And I guess that maybe was a bit of an aha moment in, I think it was 2013. We brought Ray Archuleta to Vermont, and that was very profound. He came to speak to farmers and food system experts in the state about the connection of the way we produce our food and the importance of soil health. And that was pretty remarkable. I think it had a big impact. It had a big impact on me and the trajectory of my career, but also it had an impact on, I think, everybody that heard him. And then, over the years in Vermont, we focused more and more on soil health and then regenerative agriculture.
That's interesting. Yes, I like this reframing of, well, if you think about something in systems and at all the interconnections of the different nodes in the system, there's not one, well, silver bullet is a different concept, but maybe not one thing that has a greater effect than others. But that's interesting. So reading that book for the first time, was that your introduction into the food system, and that's what sparked the journey you just described. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was probably the first piece that I had read, and it set me down a path of food systems. In college, I was studying human ecology, and then I studied natural health and herbalism. And so it was, it really was like over time, I realized that food was just so integral to all these things I cared about so deeply, and that if we work to transform our food system, but as I was working on the local food movement for many years, we were often coming up against so many barriers and so many challenges to help farms be viable, as an example. And many of those barriers were policy, federal policy, which is very challenging to change.
What's an example of this type of policy barrier?
I mean, there's federal subsidies mainly that go toward large commodity farmers. I think overall small and medium-sized farms are at quite a disadvantage in terms of the support that they receive from the government. Crop insurance is another example that pays out heavily to the larger farms, and smaller farms have a lot of barriers to even accessing those programs. I mean, essentially, we're incentivizing and subsidizing the wrong things, right? So we're incentivizing farms to get bigger, and we've lost so many farms in our country over the last 50 years and continue to lose small and medium-sized farms. So, and the environmental aspects is another thing. I mean, there's certainly conservation programs, but I think overall there's so much reform that needs to be done at the federal level. So that's when I started working for Senator Bernie Sanders, and tried to go down that policy path for a while, and then led the Regenerate America campaign at Kiss the Ground.
Yes, which is a movie all of the listeners should check out. Also, they just launched a second one, Common Ground. And I think in terms of what you also mentioned about community and local communities rallying to support local farmers, I think there's something really special there about our human connection with the land that we're on. And we have been separated by so many degrees from basically everything that we consume, from our food to our clothes to our electronics. I couldn't tell you what went into making this mouse and where it came from. But everything is coming from the earth. So having relationships with farmers, I think, can be a really fundamental shift in how we consume food. And thinking about that consumer lens, I think it can often be confusing if we don't know our farmers, what it is that we're really buying. And now we have all these terms like organic or regenerative. Organic is a generally protected term, so it's defined, if I understand correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so I would love to dive into what the difference is between the two. And let's start there. If you had to explain the difference between organic and regenerative, how would you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe we start with regenerative. It's important to recognize that, well, one, we don't have a federal definition or any definitions really in statute, except for California's definition, new definition that came out in January. And regenerative agriculture is really about a set of principles, and it's about the outcomes that are achieved from people stewarding the land managers' stewardship. And it's an approach, and those principles are, keeping the ground covered with living roots in the system, minimally disturbing it with tillage or chemicals, increasing biodiversity. That's a really important one. The integration of animals for fertility and management, and then context. And I think context is honestly the most important of the principles to me anyway, because one practice applied in Vermont is very different. You have very different outcomes and a very different approach from that practice being applied in Arizona, as an example. And, I think Native Americans and indigenous people knew this very well for millennia. They've understood this, and years of living and relating to specific, geographical regions. They learn to caretake the land and foster abundance with abundance food on that land. And they knew very well about those interrelationships and the interdependence, which I think is really the foundation of regenerative agriculture.
So California is the first state in the US to actually put a definition to what regenerative agriculture is. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on why this matters, and what, if you know anything about this process of getting to this definition.
Yeah, I wasn't involved with the process personally, but I do know some people who were. And I think that they worked on it for maybe 2 years. It was certainly a while. And they said they spent a lot of time on the process, and it was just published in January. So I have it pulled up here. I wanted to read a little bit from it. I think it's really interesting. I think it's a good starting point. So it says, regenerative agriculture, as defined for use by the state of California policies and program, is an integrated approach to farming and ranching rooted in the principles of soil health, biodiversity, ecosystem resiliency, leading to improved targeted outcomes. So that's I think a great start. It says regenerative agriculture is not an endpoint, which we've talked about a lot, but a continuous implementation of practices. I say practices, which, I think a lot of people in the regenerative agriculture movement would say, this isn't really just about practices. This is about principles. And so it's interesting that they use that term, that over time minimize inputs and environmental impacts and further enhances the ecosystem while maintaining or improving productivity, economic contributions, and community benefits. Regenerative agriculture is an ongoing continuum. Love that. Of sustainability for California's farmers and ranchers, informed by current science, as well as traditions and innovations from the original indigenous stewards of the land, which is also wonderful. Very similar. This is actually very similar to our definition we used for the Regenerate America campaign. And we have some people involved with that campaign that were part of this process. They go on to provide a sample of possible outcomes and say that it will require processes, practices, monitoring, evaluation, and innovation to be customized to specific production systems, ecoregions, and local indigenous regional cultural regions. So I think in many ways this is a really pretty solid start for a definition, but it does leave a lot of room for interpretation. It doesn't necessarily lay out the principles, and it doesn't say how those outcomes would be measured. But certainly, I do think this is an important step for people to start taking, even if it isn't perfect, that we are starting to put these definitions out there and then seeing how they're going to be implemented, how they're going to be measured, because ultimately it's really unknown whether we will get a federal definition. Well, if we'll get a federal definition, if we'll get a federal program for regenerative or not. We have all these certifications, private certifications out there right now that are serving that role. But similarly with organic, for decades we had state certifiers doing the work, and that really wasn't until like 2002 that a federal program was fully stood up. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot that remains unknown about the direction of whether we'll have a federal program or not.
And so going back to the definition, that was a lot. And what are the key components there that you mentioned? The principles, the outcomes. There's some, if I remember, some mention of reducing inputs and looking at the productivity of the land, both economically, ecologically, and even for community benefits. So
there's a lot in there.
Right, there's a lot in there. And how do you think this would affect certifications and maybe even policy to have a definition like this?
I think that I'm going to ask this question on the panel at the Regenerative Agriculture Conference in Chicago, because I'll have 3 or 4 panelists that are from various regenerative certifications. And I think I would love to maybe even read this there and then ask them what they think about it and how it compares to their definitions and their actual certification programs. Because this was not meant to be a certification program. They made that very clear. This was meant to be a definition that could be used within the various programs. So if there's a program in California that's incentivizing regenerative farmers and wants to pay them maybe a payment for ecosystem service or something like that, then they would use this definition. So I think it would be a great conversation with them to see is this robust enough? Is there enough meat in it? Was it a good starting point? What could be changed? So I think I will turn that and ask them that, Elena.
I'll have to attend the panel, and I'm curious to hear everyone's perspective on this. But thank you for breaking down this definition. I think this is an important step for the regenerative movement, or at least an interesting one. And we'll see where this goes. And how does that compare to organic agriculture definitions and certifications?
Organic is also, I think, very much about stewardship, because that certification went down a path of federal standards, which was important in many ways to make sure that there was accountability, and that we could also have a federal program and federal support to advance regenerative agriculture. But because of that, and with any standard and program like that, there are pros and cons. I mean, I think organic has done a really good job of having strict accountability around synthetics and synthetic chemicals, pesticides and fertilizers, and there are other pieces as well, antibiotics. So I think from a consumer perspective, there are certain guarantees that you feel like if you buy organic, that you're really going to be sure that there are certain pieces of that are going to be part of that product, and you can feel that assurance around the quality. And the principle, I think the approach to organic has always been rooted in soil health. And so I think that's really important. I think that's a really important similarity between the two. But there's not necessarily a requirement around soil health, especially in terms of outcomes as well as practices. And I think most organic farms are probably using cover crops as an example, but most are not reducing tillage. I think organic in general is pretty heavy tillage. And so when you're looking at the principles of regenerative agriculture, I think many organic farmers are using some of those principles or all of those principles. Yet the way the standards were set up federally, there are many organic farms, especially the larger ones, thinking of those larger organic vegetable or berry farms as an example, using a lot of monocrops, very heavy tillage. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement on the organic side, and can learn from regenerative. And going back to regenerative, I think that overall, there are many regenerative farmers who are going down a pathway of reducing the chemical usage, especially because it's expensive. And over time, if your soil is improving, then you don't need the costly inputs. But overall, regenerative certifications are not fully prohibiting the use of chemicals. They consider it, a tool in the toolbox, and overall you'd reduce it over time. There are a few that do. Regenerative organic certification obviously is one, ROC, as well as Demeter. The biodynamic doesn't allow, and then real organic is another one that so organic is the baseline, and then you do more to improve soil health. I really see it as a big pathway, and I think that there's degeneration and there's regeneration, and farmers are somewhere along this pathway. And unfortunately, many farmers in this country are degenerating their land. We're losing 4.6 tons of topsoil per acre per year.
Wow.
Yeah, that's almost 4 pickup trucks full of topsoil just driving off every acre, losing, from wind and
being washed into our waterways.
And flood. Yes, exactly. So much room for improvement, and we have to get all farmers down this pathway, right? And there's organic farmers that are very far along the pathway, and there are organic farmers that are not. And then there's regenerative farmers that are very far down the pathway, and farmers that are just starting out, maybe using no-till and just learning about the principles of regenerative agriculture. It is this beautiful spectrum in this pathway. And I think the most important piece is that farmers are empowered to learn about the pathway and get on the pathway. And I think organic and regenerative, it can be all part of this pathway towards regeneration and ecological stewardship of the land.
So if we were to not oversimplify it, but draw some maybe fundamentals, so organic, if you see an organically grown food, can you expect that it has been grown without any use of synthetics, whether that's herbicide, pesticides, or synthetic fertilizer? But you might not know how many practices this farmer is using to improve soil health. But when you're looking at regenerative, the main focus is on soil health and employing those principles that you talked about, like a lot of times that includes no-till, cover crops, more crop diversity to help those microorganisms in the soil bloom. But you can still use synthetics as part of your farming practices. By synthetics, we mean like synthetically created chemicals.
Yes, and there are different certifications. So I think there are, at least probably 10 that I know of that I would generally categorize as regenerative certifications. And they're all different, right? So as I mentioned, ROC is, organic as a baseline, and then you go further to regenerate your land, incorporating biological principles and practices. There are others that, it's a more of a phased out system. But yeah, There are a lot of certifications, and at this point, like we said, we don't have a federal definition. I had heard about a year and a half ago, USDA was looking to explore some kind of definition around regenerative agriculture, but as far as I know, I haven't seen anything specific yet.
And why is it so hard to define regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, it's interesting because, early on in the regenerative movement, I remember lots of folks saying that, there shouldn't be regenerative certifications. This is much more about outcomes and measuring those outcomes. It's much more about relationship to the land and these sets of principles. And it's interesting to see that now we have so many certifications, because ultimately, I think in an ideal world, maybe we don't need certifications, right? We would have the support, the incentives, the education, all the things lining up, the policy to make sure every farmer is on this pathway, right? So, and that consumers could be assured that our food was healthy and it was beneficial for ecological outcomes. But we're not there, right? And consumers do need some kind of assurance. And so here we are now with many regenerative certifications.
I want to double down on something that you said. So regenerative agriculture is about outcomes, or some people argue that it's more about outcomes. And I'm wondering, I'm not in the space of really digging into certifications and definitions, but would there be a way to build the definition around outcomes and certain outcomes that we've seen with regenerative farmers across the country or a state, even though context also varies within a state? Yeah, that seems like something that's not immediately obvious to me why that wouldn't be possible. But are there any challenges with this line of thought?
Yeah, I think there are several challenges with being able to define it around outcomes, partly because we still have a long ways to go with monitoring and outcomes verification. There's plenty of good work out there happening right now around landscape monitoring. But overall, what I mainly see is the modeling of a practice and a very general extrapolation of that. So, for example, a farmer in Vermont uses cover crops, and that just sort of gets put in a model to say, okay, generally, you're using cover crops on this many acres, so you're going to, we put it in a black box model, and you're going to get this amount of environmental benefit. That is generally what is happening. Fortunately, there are organizations that are focused on more of the actual soil health, like actually testing soil and making stronger connections between this farm did this set of practices and then testing to actually see what the impacts of that was. And so, ultimately, I think where we need to go is very robust on-farm monitoring systems to not only measure, the impacts of the stewardship on that land, but also ultimately give them data and feedback to be able to even improve more, right? Mm-hmm. So landscape feedback systems, I think, are ultimately where we need to go, to give farmers those tools to be able to regenerate their land, knowing very specifically these MRIs for the land, as my friend Abe Collins likes to say, we don't have that really right now. But in the meantime, it's really important that consumers, first of all, know about regenerative agriculture, care about regenerative agriculture, and seek out regenerative agriculture in their normal food buying habits and patterns. So for that, these certifications are playing a really important role because they are, putting it out in front of consumers that this is regenerative and this is why, and it's making consumers curious. It's giving consumers some assurance around, okay, cool, this is a certified regenerative label. I care about soil health. I want to buy food that's actively regenerating land and not contributing to all of these environmental factors, climate change. It's also giving farmers a new marketing opportunity, right? So it could be a higher price point for their products and new market access. I think there's barriers to certifications too. I mean, we saw this with decades of organic, right? There's so many benefits for a farmer to go organic, even financially, but there's this time period for organic. It's a 3-year period where you're transitioning, and it's not just the cost organic that it can be prohibitive, and it can be. And we do need organic cost share. We have an organic cost share program that is, I think, on life support at the moment because it wasn't included in the Farm Bill extension.
What does that mean?
So it's the organic cost share program is just, it's a program that helps pay farmers for the certification cost itself. So that in itself is important, but it's so much more than the cost of the certification because it's the work, the time, effort that it takes to transition before, an organic farmer can claim to get a price premium.
Right.
So
and it could take 3 years before you can actually be certified to make sure that there's no more residue of synthetics and chemicals on your fields.
Yeah. So, and it's the same with regenerative. There is this transition period for, it can be for years. And I mean, that's why many of these certifications have built in phases, right? So many of them have tiers. Regenified has tiers, as an example. And, you start down the pathway, you're learning about the principles, and then over these tiers, you're ramping up more acreage and you're applying the principles and the practices to more acreage and in a more comprehensive way. And, many of these certifications also have the technical assistance and the education built in, and they're collaborating with the farmers. I think that's so important. Education is paramount to enabling this transition to happen. I mean, financing is as well. We need incentives, we need access to capital, all of those things. Equipment can be expensive. So there's many support systems that are needed, but I think one real positive benefit with the certifications is many of them are helping with that transition and working with farmers on it.
Yes. And I think that's critical because, as you mentioned in the very beginning, this is a system. And so we need to consider the different factors like the financial, the practical and bureaucratic component of becoming certified. And just to tie it back to why defining regenerative agriculture with outcomes, the measuring and monitoring component is quite challenging. And I was at Acres last December and asked some questions about carbon credits because in the finance space, a lot of people are hailing natural capital as catalyst for getting these regenerative transitions funded. But a lot of farmers expressed that comes with a big risk. So they might have a year that was worse for their soil health, even if they employed the same practices because of environmental factors. So being tied to those outcome requirements could be too static maybe for a natural ecosystem.
Yeah, that's a really great point.
Yeah, and so the certifications also need to consider that, I assume, because if you're a regenerative farmer and you're certified, and then you have a bad year and you lose your certification, that can obviously impact your profits and your credibility. And I also was thinking when you were speaking about the importance of certification for consumers, down here we have a supermarket called Publix, and Will Harris's farm, White Oak Farm, sells in Publix. And I don't want to be quoted on this, but I don't remember seeing a certification on his beef. But I know the farm and I know that they do regenerative practices. And Publix has recently stocked up on a lot of different regenerative beefs. And so some of them have certifications. There's a grass-fed, there's pasture-raised. Some of them have the word regenerative on there. So it's quite confusing. I usually spend about 10 minutes in front of this ground beef section trying to Google the farms, and then some of them are in Australia. So I try to get more local. And I must say, it's not as easy as you might hope. So
I think it's very confusing. And like, for example, pastured or grass-fed, I mean, that doesn't mean regenerative, right? It they could be over undergrazing. There could be all sorts of problems technically with those farms. And not to mention that 75% at least of grass-fed beef sold in the U.S. is from outside of the U.S., as you said. And we've had a lot of challenges around the country of origin labeling of meat and being able to be repackaged in the U.S. and slapped with a product of the U.S. label. So fortunately, just last year, the Biden administration finalized that rule and gave kind of a timeline for companies not being able to use the product of the U.S. label if it is not born and raised in the United States. So that is it's a huge win.
Versus
because,
previously, if there was just one step in the process in the U.S., it was eligible for that label, right?
Yeah, the packaging. So, this is huge because many regenerative and grass-fed, pasture-based farmers in the United States are literally it's competition with foreign countries, and there wasn't consumer transparency there, so it was really hard to figure out unless you tried to Google it and really look into it. So yes, I think that we need a lot of consumer education. And interestingly, with regenerative, I mean, first of all, knowing your farmer is always the best approach, right? You know your farmer and you can buy your local meat and, from a meat CSA, or maybe you're lucky enough to have it in your grocery store. You can buy it from a farmer's market.
So just a little note here.
Yeah.
Can you just briefly touch on what CSA is for any of the audience that might not be familiar?
Oh, it's community supported agriculture. Yeah. So that, it was very hand in hand with the local organic farmer movement. And actually, I think it was Booker T. Watley, an African American farmer that really started it before maybe it was even called that. But developing boxes of food for their community, and that the community buys into that to help the farmer guarantee a market for that year. So rather than just like growing and trying to sell your food at a market, you're actually developing that relationship with community members, and they have they make a commitment to your food for a season or for the year. So local, knowing your farmer, always, I would say, paramount. But in the regenerative space, I have seen some incredible consumer education coming from the brands. And there are brands that are using these various regenerative certifications that I would say are actually driving the consumer demand. So they're the ones they're taking a risk, right? Not a lot of the public knows about regenerative agriculture yet. I'd say it's a niche kind of market still. And they're the ones who they care so deeply, and they want to support these farmers. They want to help farmers transition. They're looking for local, regenerative sourcing. Yet, because because people and eaters don't know that much about it, they are also in this role of educating, right? And so they are in many ways a key driver in this ecosystem of regenerative agriculture.
What are some of these brands? Do you know any off the top of your head?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some slightly bigger brands like Applegate. There's many smaller brands like Simply and Pacha, and there's nutraceutical companies like Ancient Nutrition and Gaia. There are a lot of them actually, and I mean I wouldn't say a ton, but enough where you can go to your grocery store and find these products. And there's actually a really neat new tool called Regenerative. Some really nice folks that developed a website called Regenerative, and I can send you the URL for your listeners. And you can search for regenerative products, and you can say I want regenerative crackers, and then Patagonia provisions and Cheddies, which is a cheddar cracker company that's regenerative. I think they have the Land to Market seal, and they have lots of different regenerative certifiers, and they so it is a neat tool, because sometimes you're scanning the grocery store shelf and you're like, what's regenerative? You can't look at every label, right? So this is like a neat way.
That's cool.
And then Kiss the Ground also has some resources as well on the Kiss the Ground, the nonprofit, on their website has some little guides to, regenerative meat and regenerative eggs and regenerative snacks and things like that. So, but the Regenerative is a neat searchable database. I find that really useful for consumers if they're really pumped on looking for regenerative products.
I'll definitely share those links in the show notes. So that was a really awesome aside. So you were mentioning that a lot of these brands are also taking the initiative to educate consumers and drive consumer demand. So education is a big piece, just like you mentioned, certifiers helping farmers in their transition also through education programs.
Yeah, I think that educating about soil health can be a tricky thing, right? And in many people's minds, the average person, they're not necessarily thinking about soil health, but more and more companies are trying to make this connection between soil health and environmental outcomes, and as well as nutrition. And that's a really, really interesting direction as well, is that there are many of these companies that are recognizing that their food is more nutritious, and they're starting to get it tested. And there's a Nutrient Density Alliance. I'm actually on the Nutrient Density Alliance design team, and there are many brands that are part of this Nutrient Density Alliance. They know their products are healthier, so they're trying to figure out, first of all, what can be said legally about the nutritious quality of their food, having some of it tested to be able to prove some of that. But we also increasingly have a lot of scientific research, peer-reviewed papers that are also showing that, for example, pasture-raised meats are higher in omega-3s and polyphenols, and there is evidence to start to back this up. And I think we're still in this early phase where there's still a little bit of unknown about what you're able to say and what claims you're able to say. But the Nutrient Density Alliance is working on all these things. And actually, Mary Purdy from the Nutrient Density Alliance that leads that is going to be doing a session at the Regenerative Agriculture Conference in Chicago. So I highly recommend you chat with her.
Actually, yeah, we do have a podcast episode scheduled also. So I agree. I think that the health component is, people really care about the health. Not everyone cares about environment or even soil science, but people understand their health and minerals and nutrients and vitamins that are in your food.
Exactly.
And so I'm excited about that work becoming more and more common knowledge in public. And I'm also curious, just to tie it back to the organic and regenerative distinction, I don't know if there's been any research done comparing the two, if that's even something that's relevant, because as you said, there's such a spectrum on how many practices organic farmers do that are related to soil health versus regenerative. But that would be an interesting comparison as well.
Yeah, and I think there has been some research done. I mean, there's certainly been quite a bit of research on organic. And with regenerative agriculture, there's been a lot of research on soil health, right? So it could be regenerative or organic. There are things that we feel pretty confident about and other aspects that I think more research needs to be done. Carbon sequestration is one of those examples. I think we know that healthy soil can sequester carbon, but there are so many variables. And every study is really looking at a different piece of land, and to try to make these generalizations can be very challenging. And we certainly can accrue carbon in the soil. How long we can sequester it, I think, is still a little bit. We know we can steward carbon and steward biology and steward soil health. And so there are so many other benefits besides just carbon sequestration. Biodiversity is a huge one, right? Where we've lost so much biodiversity. We've had insect apocalypses, like practically. We've lost incredible amount of biodiversity over the years. And as farmers go down the path of regeneration, they're seeing all of this biodiversity come back to their lands. They're seeing birds that they hadn't seen in decades. And so there are just incredible outcomes, and I think there's some great research out there, some wonderful researchers. The 100, I haven't talked about the 100 million acres campaign yet.
I was going to ask you about that next.
Yeah.
Yes. So tell us a little bit about this campaign. 100 million acres, that's a lot.
Yes, it is a lot. It's a little over 10% of all the agriculture land in the United States. And the Kiss the Ground movie that came out in 2020 was pretty remarkable in how many people watched that film. It came out during the pandemic and without having a theatrical run, but people just gravitated towards this film, and it really galvanized the regenerative movement, the soil health movement. And then the follow-up film is called Common Ground, and Josh and Rebecca Tickell, the directors of the film, really wanted the Common Ground film to be used to really galvanize the movement and help advance the regeneration of land. And so that's how the 100 million acre campaign was born. Is like, let's make this a social impact campaign for the Common Ground film. And the core element of it is a pledge. And farmers can take the pledge and consumers can take the pledge. But the heart of it is that brands take the pledge. So companies are taking the pledge to work towards transitioning 10% of their supply chain. I mean, that could be product categories if they know the acreage. Many don't know the exact acreage. But ultimately, and it's to work with a certifier or a verifier. So we're working with all of these certifiers. And many of them, as I mentioned, are different, but there's similarities, and we have a criteria for what we would allow in as a certifier. And so brands are
organic certifies, regenerative, or both?
So we have regenerative certifications. We also, we have regenerative organic, ROC, we have real organic. So for organic, this was a big conversation around, should we allow a company that has an organic label in without knowing that, without showing that there is regeneration happening on their land. And we really went back and forth. We actually talked with a lot of folks in the organic community. They really wanted to just have that be organic was allowed. Organic is the foundation of all of this. We are so grateful for the organic movement, all the organic pioneering farmers. Many of them are doing an incredible job. But organic has faced some setbacks over the last few years, with hydroponics being allowed, which is not soil grown at all. Nothing wrong with hydroponic. It's just not regenerative, and it's not soil based. And there's other challenges too. There have been some other challenges with their organic. I mean, there are large organic monocrops as an example, and there's heavy tillage in some of the farms. So we basically said if you're organic, you need to show some effort with your supply chain. Maybe it's some kind of third-party verification that there are organic companies that are doing an incredible job, like Organic Valley is an organic dairy co-op. They have this great insetting program where they're working with farms and they're doing soil testing and verifications, and like they're really committed. So I think we aren't just letting any organic brand to take the pledge. We do need to show some other commitment. So to my mind, I think that these movements are complementary. They have so much to learn from each other. It's all part of this continuum that we need to move all the farmers down the path. And I think for a lot of brands are like, great organic, great regenerative. Like they see both as such an asset. And so I think it will be really important for the movements and the sectors to work together.
Right. And you're setting an interesting example with the 100 million acre pledge program of, after a lot of discussion, allowing organic farmers to be part of this if they also work on soil health, as you just explained, which brings the two together in a way that's really important.
Yeah, I think so. And any farmer can take the pledge. We're just happy to have any farmer be excited about soil health. Any consumer can take the pledge. For the brands, though, there is a requirement that they work with a certifier or third-party verifier.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I want to tie this back. So you also are the founder or co-founder of InCommon, which is a consulting firm. Is this a project that you're working with through InCommon? What other projects are you involved in, or are you looking to get involved in?
Yeah, so my business partner, Aisha Ali, we worked at Kiss the Ground together, running the Regenerate America campaign, and then we founded InCommon Group about a year ago. So one of our clients is Big Picture Ranch, so we're leading their 100 million acre campaign. But we have a lot of other projects. We're food systems experts, and we, of course, we have our policy background, but really a lot of the areas we're working in is around strategic communications and, telling the story of regenerative agriculture, helping a group of regenerative grass farmers set up a consumer-facing campaign, helping the state of Maine with setting up a regional food system fund for farmers and ranchers and fishers in their state.
Exciting.
We are doing research on food as medicine and how to increase values-aligned procurement, including regenerative food in food as medicine programs. As we know, these food as medicine programs are emerging and growing throughout the country. And, if your food is medicine truly, it needs to also be regenerative, organic, and local. So that is another project. And yeah, just doing a variety of reports and research and lots of strategic communication. So I'm really excited to be kind of getting back into the regional and local food system space. Also really happy to be continuing to work with brands and on their journey, sharing the story, and then with farmers as well. So
that's a really broad spectrum of projects. And I feel like we could probably talk an hour about each of those and learn a lot. So where could someone find out more about InCommon?
Well, we have a website, InCommonGroup.com, and folks are always welcome to reach out to my email at Erica@InCommonGroup.com. Happy to chat anytime.
Awesome. I'll post that link in the show notes as well. So as we come to the end of our conversation, I have another question for you. When you're in the store, how do you approach shopping? Do you mostly look for products online? Let's say if you want to get a new coffee, or if you are in the grocery store, maybe you don't even go to the grocery store and you have a CSA. But as someone who is so deeply involved in the food systems and in this transition in your personal life, how do you source your food?
Yeah. I mean, it's a little different now that I'm in Kansas City than Vermont, because I was part of growing Vermont's local food system for many, many years. And we got to the point where I was working with retailers, getting local meat into grocery stores, restaurants, institutions, farm to school, farm to hospital, all the things, right? So local food is very ubiquitous there. So you have so many choices and you can pretty much find it anywhere. So it's actually quite easy in a lot of ways compared to many other places. Coming to Kansas City, I'm going in the grocery store. There's not a lot of local, not a lot of regenerative, and actually going back and just making relationships with farmers. So going to the farmers market and buying directly from farmers. It's actually been really nice to not to have to rely on the easy crutch of Vermont, where everywhere there's local food and organic farmers. So it's been great. And they do have a wonderful food system in here. It's not in the restaurants and the grocery stores as much. But that actually also made me really focus on, okay, well, when I'm in the grocery store, what actually is regenerative? And I have been using that RegenMade database, and I was like, Chetty's? Like, that was a company that I saw, and it's like, what is this? I mean, it's a new cracker company, but it's regenerative, and it's certified regenerative, land to market. And it was like, wait, there actually are a lot of products. So, again, it's hard to just walk through the grocery store and figure it out. And that's why I think having these organizations and companies that, that make it easy for consumers to be able to find that. And then some of the certifying sites also have great lists themselves. I think ROC has a nice list of so you could know if you especially if you really want regenerative and organic, then ROC is a great choice. And you can actually find what products are what brands and the products that they have certified, which I think is also really helpful. And so that's another avenue that consumers could take.
So investing a little bit of time beforehand, looking at those online resources, finding the brands that appeal to you, and then connecting with local farmers by going to the farmers market, striking up a conversation. Maybe they even have a CSA, like we talked about earlier. Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah. And now you can buy a lot of local food online. So, I mean, it may not be local to me, but there are many regenerative meat livestock farms around the country that are raising and packaging meat. Will sell online too, and you can get it shipped nationally. So there are quite a few really great farms that are doing that, and that's another option.
All right.
And Thousand Hills, I'll just say, finally, Thousand Hills, a Lifetime Raised. You can buy that actually now in like Sprouts, a bunch of natural grocery stores. So it's getting out there. More of this regenerative food is getting out there, which is great.
Yes, and that's exciting because most people still go to the grocery store to get most of their food. So if there are the options there available and we support them by buying those options, then the grocery stores will notice and bring more of these types of brands and local meats and vegetables onto the shelves. So I think our listeners have a to-do now, some homework. And thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your wisdom with our audience today, Erica.
Thanks, Elena. It was really nice to speak with you. I look forward to meeting you at the conference.
Me too. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to Seeds of Hope. Our wonderful theme music is composed by Dane Myers. If you enjoyed the show, please follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube so you never miss an episode. Share it with a friend who might find it inspiring. And if you're loving the podcast, we'd be grateful if you could leave a rating and review on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. It really helps others discover us. See you next time, and thanks again.